So just a quick housekeeping announcement at the start of this session. Really good to be with you this afternoon. We're going to cover quite a lot of material at a relatively high speed. I only have one speed setting, which is fast. If you play me back, turn it down about half speed, and it sounds normal and deeper. But what we are doing is we're making available the slides that I'm sharing. So if you haven't already got those, I don't know if Tony got my link in time. If you go to my personal website, andybannister.net, /ELF2020, andybannister.net/ELF2020. For each of the sessions, I'm doing 7 sessions at ELF these few days, quite busy. Find the one that you're interested in, or if you don't find this talk interesting, find a different one. And you can pull down the slides and then follow along. And if there's a quote that I've used that you really like, you can kind of, use it afterwards in your own material, and so on and so forth. Well, my experience as an evangelist and an apologist and a communicator and a scholar, I wear, like many of us do, actually lots of hats, depending on what I'm doing and when. My experience has been pretty uniform. I've kind of learnt really much the hard way, actually, from watching others, but also personally, and particularly from watching brilliant men and women. I'm a kind of average sort of speaker, but there are some brilliant speakers out there. And from watching brilliant men and women, I've learnt that, you can be an average thinker and preacher and evangelist and leader and communicate really, really well and have a tremendous impact. On the other hand, you can be a brilliant thinker and preacher and evangelist and communicate poorly and have less of an impact. Communication really is hugely important. It can magnify, otherwise sort of fairly standard content. It can also squash content that deserves to be much more widely heard. And so this afternoon, we're going to think a little bit about communication and perhaps some ways we can perhaps do it more effectively. To misquote the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade movie, he communicated poorly. Now, one of the things I think we need to learn right at the start is that we mustn't make the mistake of assuming that because we've written or because we've spoken, we've communicated. I think particularly actually in this digital age, that's a very common mistake. Individuals, churches and organizations assume because they put a piece of content out there, because they've communicated, that the job is done. But as somebody once said, no one's quite sure who first said this. This quote's been attributed to various people, including George Bernard Shaw and others, but no one really knows who first said it. But the truth, I think, is really a significant one, that the greatest problem when it comes to communication is the assumption that it's occurred. And we mustn't think just because we've communicated that therefore we've succeeded in communication. And this kind of breakdown between communication and content, the ability for really bad content plus great communication to do well, and the reverse to be true, I first really began to notice that in my own area, evangelism and apologetics, back in the sort of middle of the 2000s, when a movement known as the New Atheism broke. Many of you may be aware of that phenomena, the New Atheism. And that was a movement sort of centered around men. It was largely men, people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. And that last one on the screen is not Santa Claus, that's Daniel Dennett, atheist thinker from the USA. And their books and their articles and their videos were littered with terrible arguments, terrible scholarship. Even fellow atheists sort of often rolled their eyes, but they made a tremendous influence. Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, sold 6.5 million copies. And I always say that, Richard may not believe in God, but his bank manager gives thanks every day. And so those people had a tremendous impact because they figured out how to communicate, even though what they were communicating wasn't particularly helpful. And then on the other side of it, as an evangelist and an apologist, a writer and a speaker, I've seen both the mistakes that I've made personally and that I've sometimes seen in colleagues, that you can have the best arguments in the world, the best material in the world, but you've got to communicate it clearly, otherwise it all ends in nothing. And I think one of the most important things I've learned as an evangelist and an apologist, that certainly applies in that kind of mission setting, but I think applies in any setting where we want to communicate, is to remember that behind the person who's asking the question, behind the person we're trying to communicate to, is a human being. Behind every question is a questioner. And if we're engaging in things like social media, behind every social media account is a person. And if we're not careful, and this sort of information saturated age, I think we can fall into the fallacy of forgetting that we're not addressing disembodied minds, but we're addressing people. We're addressing people with passions, people with prejudices, people with interests and hearts, as well as minds. Now, as I share some thoughts about how we put those pieces together in terms of, as Christians, how we communicate, I want to put a qualifier in right at the start. I've never lectured particularly on rhetoric. I've never published on communication, but I am a communicator. And over the last 15 years or so, I've had the privilege of speaking to hundreds of thousands of people in different contexts around the world. And having written, and now, as Tony very kindly talked about in the intro, Solas does a lot of work in the digital space. So I think I've had quite a good bit of experience at trying things that and finding out what works, trying things and finding out what doesn't work. And so really what I'm sharing with you this afternoon just comes from experience, just some things that I've learned and tried, and hopefully some of that wisdom I can pass on. If it's helpful, use it. If it's not helpful, just lay it to one side. But I really want to share with you two things in my remaining kind of 18 minutes this afternoon. I firstly want to share with you what I like to call the 3-level approach to engagement, particularly to answering questions that we use at Solas, and also that we used when I was with Ravi Zacharias Ministries. I was the Canadian director for 6 years. A 3-level approach we use to engaging particularly people who have an objection to the Christian faith, but this approach works well in communication generally. And then I also want to share a couple of lessons from C.S. Lewis and Aristotle, and we're going to end with the Apostle Paul. That's roughly where we're going to go in the next 17 or so minutes. Well, let's begin with the kind of 3-level communication approach that we would use at Solas, that we used to use at RZIM, and other organizations have used this too. And when we're trying to engage somebody who's perhaps skeptical about the Christian faith, maybe we're engaged in personal evangelism, maybe we're giving a gospel message, maybe we're trying to engage in a piece of media communication that's going to engage somebody's objection or presuppositions about Christianity. I think there are 3 things that are hugely important to bear in mind. And sometimes I've noticed Christians have a tendency to focus on one of them to the neglect of the other 2, depending on our personality type. And the 3-level approach to communication begins by recognizing that we need to ground our answer intellectually. You know, we live in an age where there are lots of different competing stories out there. As Tony said in his intro, my PhD is in Islamic studies. Islam has grown tremendously here in Europe, as it has in other parts of the world. And what that means is, as Christians, we can no longer take for granted that people will say, oh, you're a Christian, I'm willing to listen to you. We need to be willing to give a reason, to give a hope, a reason for our hope, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, and give good reasons why we believe the story that we're living, the truth that we're communicating is true. And sometimes there can be a tendency for Christians to bypass that. We forget that importance of addressing the mind, and we tend to go straight for the emotional engagement. So make sure we're giving a reason why, we're saying the fact that there are good reasons for the Christian faith into our communication. Secondly, it's important that we illustrate our answers existentially. You know, maybe there's some of you on this call who are like, well, actually, I get the intellectual part. I love thinking. I love Bible study. I love theology. I love philosophy. You know, I get the ideas part. But the part that then sometimes we can miss, and I'm probably wired this way and have to watch this one, is the importance of connecting to the heart as well as to the mind, demonstrating a kind of, you know, an existential connection with the person that we're talking to. And one way of doing that is through personal story. And over the years, I found the more I can weave my own story into the answers that I'm giving, particularly on some of the big questions of our age, the more powerful it can be. It's interesting, we're just about to release a short answer video on the problem of suffering. And that's coming out tomorrow on the Solas website. Very contemporary question, given that the kind of age that we're living in. And but you know, I've shifted over the years from giving sort of quite almost philosophical approaches to that question to, if you do catch the video when it comes out tomorrow, drawing quite personally and talking about kind of personal experiences of suffering and pain and loss. And found as I've done that, as I've shifted slightly in how I've pitched it, there's been more engagement. The communication has worked more effectively because I haven't just operated at the intellectual level, I've operated at the existential one too. And then thirdly, as well as engaging the mind and addressing the heart, the other piece that we sometimes miss is to demonstrate the pragmatic part of the Christian hope in any communication that we're giving. In other words, what difference does the gospel make in the real world in which we're communicating? A really good example of that is a couple of years ago, I had the privilege of doing a radio debate with a gentleman called Peter Singer. And Peter is one of the probably leading atheist sort of ethicists today, very leading atheist philosopher, huge influence. And I had the tremendous privilege of doing this radio discussion with him. And I worked out early on, we could certainly spar at the intellectual level. He would have run rings around me if I'd continued to do that. He was pretty good actually at the heart engagement, the existential engagement as well, even as an atheist. But where things got really interesting was where I was able to begin to unpack in our discussion the difference that Christianity made in the real world, particularly around things like human rights, human value and human dignity. And it was interesting that I think in terms of that communication piece being effective, having talked to friends who watched that dialogue I did with him, it was really when you got to the level of what does the Christian faith look like when it's actually lived out compared to atheism, where things got really, really interesting. So we need to make sure that we engage intellectually, we illustrate existentially, and we demonstrate the pragmatic difference that Christianity makes. And then this probably doesn't need saying to most of you on this call, because if you hadn't grasped this piece, you probably wouldn't be at the ELF. But it's easy to forget that in any of our communication as Christians, I think to be asking ourselves the question, how do I get this to the cross? There can be a danger, particularly for those of us who love the life of the mind, or for those of us who love the power of the written or spoken word, and we know that we're good at that, and that may be many of you, that may be why you're in this network. It can be easy to forget that our goal is to lead people to the cross. As one of my colleagues used to say, any apologetic, in terms of apologetics, that doesn't start or end with the cross doesn't deserve the title Christian. And I think it's important as we communicate, for those of us particularly involved in perhaps communicating into the public square, making sure that we don't leave people walking away thinking, my word, that was what a brilliant piece of communication, how clever that person is, what a wordsmith that individual is. Let's make sure we leave them walking away going, oh, how incredible Jesus is, or for our non-Christian friends, how intriguing Jesus is. I want to think more. And all these pieces are important because we live in a world in which feeling and emotion have increasingly replaced the rational. We live in a very feeling-based culture. And that's wrong-footed, I think, some Christian engagement in recent years. I mean, after all, it's never been the case that you could reason somebody into faith, that you could browbeat them with the power of your intellectual communication. But certainly, I think it's been the case that a few decades ago, more weight was placed in European and Western culture on perhaps the intellectual component of a piece of communication. But our postmodern culture that we increasingly find ourselves in doesn't respond quite so well here. And so I want to draw a little bit in this kind of next segment of my session this afternoon, just to draw some thoughts from Aristotle to help us here. So we've kind of looked at communication theory, perhaps more generally. Let's take a very quick look at Aristotle, and then we're going to come to our old friend C.S. Lewis. And years and years and years ago, long before even Tony and I were born, Aristotle wrote on rhetoric. And he observed that actually in any good piece of communication, there are three things that you need to persuade somebody. And of course, any piece of communication, whether it's a Christian message or a piece of advertising, wants to persuade somebody to take an action. And if you want to persuade somebody, Aristotle said, there's three things you need to think about. There's three things that we need to engage. Firstly, there's the intellectual component of the argument. We won't spend much time here. We just talked about that. That's what Aristotle called logos. But then there's what Aristotle called ethos. And that's what one's friends and peers and community think. And one of my friends, who's a senior member of the RZAM, Rabbi Zacharias Ministry speaking team, Abdu Murray, I wrote a brilliant little book on engaging people's questions and communicating well a few years ago called Grand Central Question. And he talked about, he came from a Muslim background. 15, 16 years ago, Abdu was a Muslim. And he shares in the book his story of his journey to faith. And he talks about the fact that in his experience, both in terms of his own faith journey, but also communicating now with Muslims, he said, a great question to ask a Muslim when you're engaging with them about the Christian faith is this one. If you were to become a Christian, what would happen next? Would your friends, would your family throw a party for you? Would there be a wonderful celebration? And he said that question often reveals the fact that for many Muslims who are considering Christ, the stumbling block is what their community think. He said it was for him. You know, he got the intellectual piece long before he became a Christian. The issue he had to deal with was what those whose opinions really mattered to him, friends and family and the community thought. And sometimes in our communication, we forget the fact we're not talking to disembodied souls. We're talking to people who've got friends and a peer group, and that can be a big influence. And we need to think about how we factor that in to our communication. And then thirdly, Aristotle talked about this whole component of pathos, the emotional quality of the speaker. As the Apostle Paul famously said in 1 Corinthians, you know, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels but don't have love, I'm just a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. In other words, if we don't have our words, if our character doesn't measure up to our words, people are going to see the difference. And my word, do we live in a culture where that's true? You know, we live in a very much a social media age where, you know, people are very quick to shine the spotlight on a disconnect between the words that you say and your lifestyle, and perhaps more than ever before. And it's always been important as Christians to be consistent, but certainly today's age, you cannot get away with being inconsistent. But although, you know, I think Aristotle's really helpful here with his emphasis on these three aspects of communication that we need to be factoring into our engagement, there's a fourth thing that he missed from his list that I think is incredibly important. In fact, as someone who's sort of, you know, my entire career now, I guess, is as a communicator, I think there's a massive piece that Aristotle misses that someone else picks up. And this is the whole issue of how we engage the imagination. Blaise Pascal, the famous Christian philosopher, once said that, you know, our task as Christians, as we share the gospel, is to present the gospel, is to present Christ in such a way that good people wish that it were true, and only then do we take the time to show them that it is. And there's a lot of wisdom, I think, in that. So often as Christians, we can go straight for the trying to show people it's true before we presented the gospel in such a way that people hear us and say, oh, I wish these things were true. So how do we do that? How do we capture people's imaginations and really make them see the attractiveness and the beauty of Jesus and the Christian faith? Well, for another famous thinker, C.S. Lewis, the answer to that was through story. Lewis, in an essay, talked about the idea that often the front doors of people's minds, as he put it, are guarded by watchful dragons that keep out any sort of element of truth sneaking through. But he said, I wonder whether through story, whether through the imagination, there might be ways to tiptoe past those watchful dragons that guard the front door so that we can take truth in the side door. In fact, what Lewis says here is, I think, so significant that it's worth quoting in full. Let me read to you from his essay, Of Other Worlds. Lewis writes, he says, I thought I saw how stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told that one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings. And reverence itself did harm. The whole subject was associated with lowered voices, almost as if you were dealing with something medical. But supposing that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could. And I remember coming across that essay by Lewis about 7 or 8 years ago. And as I was planning to write a book responding to our new atheist friends, to Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens and that whole crowd. And what I did is, I'm not a fiction writer like Lewis is. I'd be no good at that kind of thing. But people do occasionally tell me that I can be quite funny. And so I actually wrote a book that used far more an imaginative approach called The Atheist Who Didn't Exist. And it was an attempt to use comedy as a communication vehicle for the Christian faith. I thought, well, I can't tiptoe past the watchful dragons using story, but maybe I can tickle the dragon under the nose, and while it's rolling on the floor laughing, I can charge in through the front door. And was actually really amazed by some of the response that when you take that approach. I got story after story of people emailing me saying that friends and family members who were deeply skeptical about the Christian faith had picked up that book, read the first few pages, and because that got them laughing, they were willing to read the remaining 200 pages. And there's something I think about story and imagination and the arts is very, very powerful when it comes to Christian communication. And of course, C.S. Lewis himself found this personally. It was Lewis who was, was largely led to faith in Christ through the imagination, through literature, and through story. In fact, in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis says it was in reading G.K. Chesterton, as in reading George MacDonald, that I did not know what I was letting myself in for. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful about his reading. And as we draw these threads together, I've thrown a lot at you, and there'll be a lot to discuss and think about in the discussion of the Q&A. But as we draw these threads together, I want to just end by planting the seed of the idea that, of course, reaching the imagination as well as the mind and the heart, although it's often neglected today in the church, we sometimes forget about the need to engage the imagination. It's a very ancient idea. It goes back to Jesus, who used stories and the parables, and it goes back to Paul. And in a very famous passage in Acts 17, as he's seeking to engage the very, very non-Christian culture there in Athens, Paul directly draws on story. In fact, he draws on a pagan story of all things. And if we had time, I would actually read you Acts 17 verses 16 to 34. The clock is against us, so I won't read you this text. When you get a moment, perhaps later this evening, pull open Acts chapter 17 verses 16 and following. Just read through here and see how Paul uses the stories of the culture that he's addressing in order to connect into them and present the gospel. And what I'm struck by is the way that Paul behaves here, the way that Paul uses communication and story of the imagination. There are some things here that we can learn as we seek to engage our culture, particularly our very secular Western culture, with the gospel. Just 5 things that Paul did that I want to leave you with. And we haven't got time to unpack them in huge detail, but if there are particular things you want me to push into, ask in the Q&A and we can address them. But Paul observes, before he says anything, he walks around Athens and looks at what's going on. He understands the culture and figures out the stories of the culture. We need to make sure we're doing that for our culture. What are the big stories that are being told through music and art and media and movies and so forth? What are the alternative stories to the Christian faith out there? Secondly, you'll see when you read Acts through your ledger later that Paul engages. Although the Athenian culture was very idol-driven, he doesn't go in there all guns blazing, but he finds the altar to the unknown God, if you remember the story, and he bridges off it to the gospel. He relates to his audience. He quotes their own stories, their own poets, their own art, and uses it as a bridging point to the gospel. Challenge to us there, right? How well do we know the stories of our own culture so that we can engage with our friends and our neighbours and our colleagues because we know the stories that they're tied into. That said, he wasn't afraid to critique. But interesting, when you read Acts chapter 17, verses 16 and following, and you see how Paul critiques there, he doesn't, again, go in all guns blazing, but what he really tries to do is show the Athenians that the stories they're invested in really only have their fulfillment in the gospel. In fact, what my friend Dan Strange, in his little book Plugged In, calls subversive fulfillment. Dan writes, the gospel is the subversive fulfillment of culture. It subverts and then it confronts, it unpicks, it overthrows the world stories. However, the gospel fulfills in that it connects and is shown to be worthy of our hopes and our desires. The gospel is appealing in that it's a call to exchange old hopes rather, and desires for new ones, because these new ones are the originals from which our false stories are smudged and ripped fakes. And then lastly, Paul gets it to Jesus as quickly as possible. And it's interesting today, as I spend at least half my time engaged in very secular settings, I don't think people today are necessarily resistant to hearing about Jesus, but they want to know why he's important. Before we leap to arguments for his existence or his resurrection or so on and so forth, remember, we first need to show people why Jesus matters, why his story is compelling, why it's the only story that makes sense, yes, of the facts, but also of the hopes and fears and desires and longings there in our culture that bubble up in other stories, which are ultimately just a reflection of the ultimate biggest story of all.